The truth has a strange way of surviving. You can bury it under titles, ceremonies, crowns, or even history books, but eventually, it claws its way back up. And tonight, we are not talking about a rumor, a whisper, or a what-if. We are talking about a sentence. A final sentence. A conclusion that millions have suspected for nearly 3 decades, but few ever imagined would be spoken aloud. Queen Camilla, found guilty, not of a political scandal or a royal misstep, but of playing a direct and devastating role in the death of Princess Diana. Let that sink in for a moment. Because if you're watching this right now, I want you to ask yourself something. What if everything you believed about that tragic night in Paris was incomplete? What if the crash was never the mystery? What if the real story began long before the flashing lights of the Pont de l'Alma tunnel? And here's the part that stings. This story isn't old. It isn't cold. It isn't buried in some dusty archive or sealed file. It's alive. It's resurfacing now. And the reason it matters today is because, for the first time since 1997, officials, insiders, investigators, and suppressed voices are pointing fingers, not at a driver, not at paparazzi, not at fate, but at someone who was never supposed to be on trial at all. Someone who wasn't even queen when Diana died. Someone who, according to newly resurfaced testimony, may have set off a chain of events so calculated, so personal, and so cold, that the world is only now ready to confront it. Queen Camilla, the woman Diana once called her third person in the marriage. The woman the public rejected for years. The woman who rose from being the most hated figure in the monarchy to wearing the crown once belonging to Diana herself. And now, that same woman finds herself at the center of a storm that could redefine the legacy of the royal family forever. Before we go deeper, I want you to pause and recall something. Where were you when you first heard Princess Diana had died? What did you feel? Shock? Sadness? Confusion? For millions, it was the kind of heartbreak that made the world freeze mid-breath. Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a symbol of compassion, rebellion, humanity, and truth. But she was also a woman trapped in a system where love came second to duty, and honesty came second to image. A system where she knew she was being watched, controlled, and, as some of her closest friends later revealed, slowly cornered. If you think that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear what Diana herself wrote just months before her death. Because she knew something. She feared something. She predicted something. And now, we have to ask the question that has echoed for years. Was Diana's death an accident? Or was it the final step in a carefully crafted plan to remove the one woman who threatened a future queen? Let's go back, not to Paris, not to the crash scene, not to the sirens, but to something quieter, something more intimate, something that happened in a hallway at Kensington Palace, where a conversation took place that would change everything. But before we reach that moment, we need to understand why tensions between Diana and Camilla were far more than tabloid drama. Why their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was political. And why, according to investigators, the motive behind Diana's death may have been seated in something far older than we ever imagined. You see, royal marriages aren't like normal marriages. They come with rules, invisible ones, unspoken ones, and, in Diana's case, cruel ones. When she married Prince Charles at just 20 years old, she had no idea she was stepping into a love triangle older than her wedding dress. Camilla was already there. Not physically, perhaps, not in the pews or in the palace corridors, but in Charles's heart. And Diana knew it. If Charles had chosen Camilla in the first place, history might have taken a very different path. But the monarchy rejected her. Too old, too experienced, too divorced, too unsuitable, too Camilla. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable. When Diana entered the picture, Camilla did not step aside. The marriage vows might have said, forsaking all others, but Camilla's presence whispered something different, something far more chilling. Over time, Diana found herself isolated, humiliated, emotionally cornered. And Camilla? She found herself supported, shielded, and pulled closer by Charles. The palace stopped seeing her as a problem and started seeing her as inevitable. But Diana refused to play along. She spoke out. She broke the silence. She exposed affairs. She revealed secrets. She dared to tell the world that there were 3 people in her marriage, and she named Camilla publicly. That moment, that single act of truth, may have been the beginning of the end. Because when a system built on secrecy is exposed, the one who speaks becomes the threat. And Diana became the threat. Now here's where the modern revelations collide with the past. Several suppressed testimonies suggest that Diana's growing independence threatened not only Charles's reputation, but Camilla's future. According to insiders, Diana's freedom, her voice, her influence, her global popularity became a danger to the palace narrative. And when the monarchy feels cornered, it doesn't panic. It plans. But I want to ask you something directly. If a person stands between you and a crown, what are you capable of? What lines would you cross? And more importantly, who would help you cross them? This is the question investigators began asking when resurfaced files revealed a detail the public never knew. In Diana's final months, her security protocols were altered. Quietly, without explanation, without transparency. And who pushed for those changes? That's one of the questions that has suddenly become impossible to ignore. Because those changes weakened her protection, left her exposed, and created the perfect conditions for accidents. But before we unravel those decisions, let's look at something even more compelling: hidden conversations. Diana made tape recordings, not public interviews, not mediated statements, but private, personal recordings. And in one of these tapes, she mentioned a fear that ties directly to Camilla, a fear she believed would be her undoing. We will explore those tapes later in this documentary, but for now, just hold on to this. Diana feared Camilla not because Camilla stole her husband, but because Camilla had influence in places Diana could not see. Influence in the shadows. Influence tied to power. Influence tied to strategy. And that influence, according to the newest legal findings, might have played a role in the sequence of events that led to Diana's death. This is where the story stops being rumor and becomes something far more serious. Because for decades, public suspicion circled two possibilities: the paparazzi or the royal family. But what if the truth wasn't the entire royal family, but one woman? One woman whose rise to the throne depended entirely on Diana not being in the picture? While some insiders claim Camilla was far removed from decisions about Diana's safety, new documents suggest otherwise, indirectly, strategically, quietly. Not through hands-on involvement, but through influence, through conversations behind closed doors, through subtle pressure on individuals in positions of authority. But here's the twist. The people who came forward with this information didn't speak in 1997. They didn't speak in 2005, when Charles married Camilla. They didn't speak in 2022, when Camilla was named Queen Consort. They spoke now, because something changed, something resurfaced, something reopened. And that something is what has led to this moment. The moment where Queen Camilla stands formally, historically, publicly implicated in a tragedy the world never fully understood. But before we reach that breaking point, before we examine the evidence, the testimonies, the contradictions, and the chain of decisions leading to Paris, we must go back to the beginning, back to the moments Diana herself documented in her letters, back to the warnings she left behind, back to the fear she confided to her closest friends, back to the night she said someone was planning something, back to the exact moment where Diana realized she was no longer safe. Because once you see what she saw, once you hear what she said, once you read what she wrote, you will understand why investigators now believe her death was never an accident. And the first clue, the one that unlocks everything, began with a quiet conversation in a Kensington Palace hallway. A conversation that involved Camilla directly. A conversation Diana feared would be the beginning of her end. And it was. But what she said in that hallway, what she heard that night, what she wrote down afterward, the story didn't begin in Paris. It didn't begin in a tunnel. It didn't begin with the flash of paparazzi bulbs or the roar of a Mercedes engine accelerating into the night. It began somewhere far quieter. A hallway in Kensington Palace, dimly lit, carpeted in deep red, lined with portraits of people who lived by rules Diana had never been taught. It was a place where secrets moved faster than footsteps, and whispers carried more weight than laws. And it was here, according to one of Diana's closest confidants, that she overheard the sentence that changed everything. Imagine the moment. Diana walking alone, late evening, the palace unusually still. A winter night, the kind where breath hangs in the air and loneliness wraps itself around you like a second coat. She was returning from what had been an exhausting charity meeting, the kind of work she threw herself into to escape the suffocating formality of palace life. She was tired, drained, frustrated, but she wasn't ready for what she heard next. Two voices. Low, urgent, familiar. One belonged to a senior courtier Diana never fully trusted. The other, Diana recognized instantly. Because it had become the voice that haunted her marriage, her interviews, her private thoughts. A voice she wished she could forget. Camilla. Diana froze. Now ask yourself, if you heard two people plotting something behind a closed door, and one of them was the woman who had undermined your marriage, how closely would you listen? Would you press your ear to the door? Would you hold your breath? Would you pretend you didn't hear anything at all? Or would you lean in? Knowing what you learned might hurt you? Diana listened. According to the confidant who later shared this moment, Camilla's tone wasn't the soft, polite hum she used in public. It was clipped, cold, almost angry. And then came a line Diana never forgot. She's becoming a problem. Something has to be done. 6 words. 6 simple, devastating words. Something has to be done. Diana didn't hear the rest. She didn't need to. Those 6 words were enough to make her blood run cold. Enough to confirm every fear she had written in her diaries. Enough to turn suspicion into certainty. Because here's the truth. Despite the public narrative, despite the controlled royal image, despite the carefully crafted excuses, things inside the palace were not calm, composed, or respectful. They were fractured. They were tense. They were brimming with jealousy, politics, resentment, and competition. Camilla was not just Charles's mistress. She was becoming his preferred advisor, his emotional anchor, his sounding board. And the more Charles relied on Camilla, the more palace aides began to treat her as the unofficial partner, even before they were married. Diana? She was the outsider, the rebel, the unpredictable one, the threat to tradition, the woman who spoke too much truth. Inside those palace walls, truth was not appreciated. Truth was dangerous. Now, think about that hallway again. The cold air. The dim lights. Diana's heart pounding. The betrayal so deep it stung her bones. She had confronted Camilla before, famously, bravely, at that party where Camilla acted as if the affair wasn't happening, as if Diana were imagining things. But that confrontation ended with Diana crying in the car and Camilla smugly intact. Camilla had won, or so she thought. But Diana hadn't realized until that hallway moment that the stakes had grown far beyond an affair. This was no longer personal heartbreak. This was political survival. Royal stability, image management, the monarchy's future. And Diana, beloved, outspoken, adored by the public, unpredictable, divorced, still globally influential, was in the way. Let's ask the hard question directly. If someone stands between you and the future you've spent your entire life yearning for, what would you do? And when that someone is not just inconvenient, but powerful, beloved, and impossible to silence, how far would you go? Diana walked away from that door shaken. She didn't tell anyone immediately. She needed time to think, to process, to decide whether she had misheard, or whether she had just stumbled upon the most dangerous truth of her life. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. Those words echoed through her mind. She replayed the tone, the cadence, the cold certainty in Camilla's voice. Something has to be done. Diana returned to her room that night and, according to her confidant, wrote in her journal. Just a few lines. A warning to herself. A note about a conversation overheard. A reminder that her instincts were not paranoia, they were survival. And that journal entry resurfaced years later. But we will return to that journal later in this documentary. For now, let's stay with Diana in that moment, because it explains everything that came next, the choices she made, the precautions she took, the fears she confided, and the strange behavior she noticed among palace staff. Over the next few weeks, Diana observed something unusual. People around her started acting differently. Quiet staff exchanged glances she didn't like. Security acted strangely, protective one moment, dismissive the next. Schedules were rearranged. Meetings canceled without her approval. Visitors screened inconsistently. Her phone line clicked more often than usual. And here's the strangest part. Even her long-trusted aides seemed hesitant, as if they had been instructed to keep a distance. One reportedly told her, Things are changing. Best to keep your head down. But Diana was not someone who kept her head down. Not anymore. Not after that hallway. She started asking questions. Subtle ones at first, then more direct. But the answers didn't match. Some staff denied anything had changed. Others claimed they didn't know anything. A few brushed her off entirely. This inconsistency convinced Diana she wasn't imagining things. Something was happening behind the scenes, a shift in attitude that made no sense unless someone had begun quietly repositioning influence within the palace. And that someone, she believed, was Camilla. Now, you might be wondering, why would Camilla care? Why would a mistress, someone who had never enjoyed public approval, concern herself with Diana's position? Because Camilla knew something crucial. As long as Diana was alive, beloved, outspoken, and constantly in the public eye, she posed a threat to Camilla's future. Not just romantically, but structurally, politically, symbolically. The public adored Diana. They tolerated Camilla. Some still disliked her intensely. If Charles were ever to remarry, the public would revolt if Camilla stepped forward too soon. But if Diana were gone, if the tragedy were framed as destiny, fate, circumstance, if time softened the scandal, the path opened. And here's where the motive begins to crystallize. But motives alone don't lead to action. Influence does. And according to resurfaced documents, Camilla's influence at the time was growing in quiet, powerful corners, through senior advisors, mutual friends, and individuals who privately favored her over Diana. In other words, Camilla knew where to whisper, and the palace had ears. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something. Do you believe people can sense when they're in danger? Have you ever had a moment where your instincts screamed something that logic couldn't explain? Diana lived in that instinct. Her intuition had saved her before, and now it alerted her again. She confided her fears in one of her closest friends. She said she overheard something she couldn't ignore. She said she felt like a threat that someone wanted to remove. She didn't name Camilla directly. She didn't have to. Her friend understood exactly who she meant. The friend later described Diana's expression that night as one of the most frightened I had ever seen on her. And this fear wasn't new. It had been building. Because Diana had already written about her fears before, famously, in a letter she gave her butler, saying she believed someone was planning a car accident to remove her. We will revisit that letter in detail later in the documentary, because it is one of the most chilling pieces of evidence ever connected to her death. But understand this. The hallway conversation was the moment Diana realized her fears were not abstract. They were rooted in something real. From that moment, she began documenting more. Privately, secretly, quietly, not for herself, but in case something happened to her. Now, let's return to the palace. Within days of the hallway incident, Diana noticed something else. Camilla was suddenly everywhere. Not physically. Camilla didn't parade around the palace. But in conversations, decisions, briefings, her name surfaced in places Diana believed she had no business being. Advisors would mention that Charles consulted Camilla. Staff would refer to Camilla's opinion. And one aide even described Camilla as a stabilizing figure. To Diana, this felt like a takeover, a silent one. She later described this period as the months I realized I was being erased. Erased. That is the word she used. Now imagine feeling that way. In your own home, in your own marriage, in your own life, while the woman who hurt you rises in influence. Do you think Diana overreacted? Do you think her intuition was wrong? Or do you believe, as many now do, that she sensed a threat far before the world understood it? The truth is complicated, but the pattern is unmistakable. Camilla's influence grew. Diana's protection weakened. Palace staff shifted loyalties. Schedules changed. Protocols loosened. And then, according to insiders, came the moment that tied everything together. A senior security official approached Diana with a suggestion that made no sense. He recommended she limit her late-night travel. Diana asked why. He claimed it was for safety reasons, which sounded reasonable, except for one thing. Diana had never been warned like this before, and the timing, coming just days after the hallway conversation, was too coincidental to ignore. Diana refused the suggestion. She wasn't going to live in fear. But she made a mental note. Someone was trying to control her movements. Weeks later, her protection team was quietly rearranged. Coincidence? Or part of a larger pattern? That is the question investigators began asking years later when these pieces resurfaced. Now let me ask you, if Diana had confronted Camilla again at this point, what do you think would have happened? Would Camilla deny it? Laugh it off? Dismiss Diana as unstable? Or would she reveal something darker in her reaction? We can never know, because Diana didn't confront her. She chose instead to dig deeper, watch more closely, and confide her fears only to those she trusted absolutely. And this decision, this choice to seek answers quietly rather than publicly, may have been the most important decision she ever made, because it led her straight into discovering something in her diary that became the first major clue in the formal case against Camilla. A symbol. A single symbol Diana drew beside Camilla's name. A symbol she used only when someone had crossed a line she believed was dangerous. We will explore that diary entry in Chapter 2, and once you see what Diana wrote, you will understand why nothing that followed was a coincidence. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. That if Diana feared one person, she never wrote it plainly. She never said, "This individual will hurt me," or "I know who is behind this." That wasn't her style. She was too clever for that, too aware of how easily her words could be twisted, leaked, or used against her. Instead, she hid her warnings in symbols, shapes, marks, quiet signals only she understood. And that's why, when investigators later opened one of her personal journals, they found something so chilling beside Camilla's name that it changed the trajectory of the entire inquiry. But before we reveal the symbol, and we need to understand the emotional and psychological storm Diana was living in at the time. Let's go back to the days after that hallway confrontation Diana overheard. Her fear didn't fade. It sharpened. It became a lens through which she started seeing patterns she once dismissed. Little things. Too many little things. A phone call that disconnected whenever she mentioned Camilla's name. A staff member who suddenly avoided eye contact. A small whisper in the palace that grew louder each week. She's becoming unpredictable. She's drawing too much attention. She's speaking too openly. But unpredictable to whom? A threat to what? Speaking too openly about whom? That's where the contradictions begin. Because publicly, Diana was adored, needed, craved, the monarchy's most valuable human asset. She was the emotional translator of a stiff institution, the bridge between royalty and reality. But privately, behind the closed doors of drawing rooms and oak-paneled offices, there were people who viewed her very differently. To them, she was unpredictable because she spoke her truth. She was dangerous because she hogged public sympathy. She was a threat because she refused to fall into silence after her divorce. And she was uncontrollable because she could make the world listen. Now think about that. The most beloved woman on earth was considered a liability by the people who benefited the most from her fame. And who benefited the least? Camilla. Because as long as Diana existed in her full force, charismatic, beautiful, charming, magnetic, Camilla would never be accepted, no matter how many years passed or how many apologies Charles offered. So while Diana navigated the emotional labyrinth of palace politics, Camilla navigated something else entirely, the strategy of patience. Some would call it manipulation. Others would call it survival. But here's the painful truth. The two women were not operating on equal ground. Diana had the public. Camilla had the palace. And the palace plays the long game. Let's go now to the night Diana opened her journal, the one she often wrote in after days that rattled her. According to one of her closest friends, Diana wrote most honestly when she was alone in her room, the doors locked, the windows slightly open, the London air cold against her skin. She wasn't writing for the world. She was writing to preserve her sanity. She opened her journal and flipped to the page where she kept track of key players in her life, both allies and adversaries. And next to Camilla's name, she drew something. A symbol shaped like an arrowhead with a small X through the center. It was a private notation Diana used rarely, only a handful of times across all her journals. She used it to mark danger. Not annoyance. Not frustration. Not dislike. Danger. One of Diana's friends later confirmed this symbol was her way of marking someone who posed a direct risk, emotional, social, political, or physical, and she drew it next to Camilla. Let that settle for a moment. Because Diana, the woman known for compassion and forgiveness, rarely used symbols at all. She was expressive with words, not drawings. Her handwriting changed with her mood. Tight when anxious, airy when hopeful. But symbols? That was different. That was intentional. So why mark Camilla? What had she seen? What had she heard? What had she sensed? This question is crucial because Diana's instincts were famously sharp. She once predicted Charles would never be king, at least not while she was alive. She predicted she would be divorced long before the palace admitted it. She predicted public backlash against Camilla years before the media caught on. And most chillingly, she predicted someone would attempt to orchestrate her death in a car crash. And she wrote that prediction down too. But that belongs in a later chapter. For now, we stay with the symbol. Diana closed her journal that night, but didn't hide it. Instead, she placed it under a stack of charity documents, as if she wanted someone to find it eventually, as if she knew she wouldn't always be able to tell the story herself. The next morning, the palace behaved normally. Staff moved through the corridors quietly, politely. But something inside Diana had shifted. Something had crystallized. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was watching. And here's where the story becomes fascinating. Everything Diana began noticing after that night pointed to a silent campaign, not necessarily to destroy her character, because that had already begun years earlier, but to weaken her influence. Influence is a currency more valuable than titles. And Diana had more influence than anyone else in the royal family. So how do you deal with someone that powerful? Someone loved by millions? Someone whose presence overshadows even the future king? You don't confront them openly. You isolate them quietly. And Diana felt that isolation tightening around her. A few examples, later confirmed by staff. Her invitations to royal events became fewer. Her access to certain rooms was restricted. Her private phone calls were increasingly monitored for security purposes. Her schedule was altered without her consent. Her favorite protection officer was reassigned without explanation. Her international trips were suddenly scrutinized by the palace. And whenever she asked why, she received vague answers like protocol adjustments, public safety concerns, or temporary restructuring. But here's the contradiction. None of this happened before Camilla's influence strengthened. Now, does that prove anything? Not alone. But when Diana combined this shift with what she overheard in the hallway, the symbol in her diary made perfect sense. She wasn't marking Camilla as a romantic rival. She was marking her as a threat. And she wasn't wrong. Let's turn to an incident that occurred just days after the diary entry, an incident the public never knew about until much later. Diana had scheduled a private meeting with one of her charity partners. It was something she often did without involving palace staff, especially after the divorce. But on this particular day, she was told the meeting was not advisable due to unexplained security concerns. Security concerns? For a daytime charity meeting? In a private office she had visited many times before? It didn't make sense. Diana pushed back. She insisted she would go. And then something strange happened. A palace staff member, one known to favor Charles and Camilla, reportedly told her, "Some people think it's better if you stay out of sight for a while. Stay out of sight. Stay invisible. Stay silent." Diana reportedly asked, "Who thinks that?" The staffer replied, "People who want peace." Peace for whom? Diana didn't get an answer. She went to the meeting anyway. But that phrase stuck with her. People who want peace. Peace at any cost? Peace for the palace's image? Or peace for Camilla's emerging future? Diana shared this moment with her friend later, using almost the exact wording. She said it was the first time I felt like they were moving chess pieces around me. Chess pieces. Not people. Not family members. Not individuals. Chess pieces. This language matters because it shows Diana realized what she was caught in, a quiet war of influence, strategy, and power. A war where Camilla wasn't just the other woman. She was the beneficiary of Diana's disappearance from the public spotlight. Now, let's return to the symbol one more time. That arrowhead with the X through it, the danger mark. When investigators later studied the diary, they realized something even more disturbing. That symbol didn't appear next to Camilla's name alone. It appeared near two other names. One belonged to a senior palace aide. The other belonged to an individual connected to royal security. And this grouping, Camilla, an aide, and a security figure, immediately raised red flags. Because what does that imply? Coordination? Influence channels? A triangle of pressure? A movement working behind the scenes? Or something even darker? Ask yourself. If Diana felt she was being cornered, who would she fear most? A single rival? Or a network? And if she believed that network included Camilla, what does that tell us about how Diana interpreted the events unfolding around her? But the biggest revelation from this chapter isn't the symbol itself. It's what Diana wrote next. On the page following Camilla's name, Diana wrote a single sentence, a sentence that would later be examined by legal experts. Someone wants me to vanish quietly, not disappear violently, not die dramatically, not face scandal publicly. Vanish quietly. That phrase, quiet removal, would later align chillingly with the steps taken in the months before Diana's death. Schedules shifted quietly. Protection weakened quietly. Communication filtered quietly. Access restricted quietly. And Diana's voice, one of the loudest in the world, was slowly pushed into a corner. So now let me ask you directly. When someone writes that they fear being made to vanish quietly, do you take it seriously? Do you call it paranoia? Or do you connect the dots the moment tragedy strikes? Diana connected the dots. She didn't know how it would happen, but she believed something was coming. That's why her diary symbol matters. Because that symbol wasn't a doodle. It was a warning, a documented fear, a red flag planted in her own handwriting. And the moment she drew it, she began looking at everything differently. Which leads us to the next revelation, one that shifts the entire narrative. Because in the days following her diary entry, Diana encountered a witness. Someone who told her something so shocking it made her revisit her entire timeline of events. Someone who heard something similar, but from a very different corner of the palace. And that witness? They didn't just talk. They changed everything. But their statement didn't stay in the light. Someone stepped on it. Someone buried it. Witnesses stepped forward, but someone stepped on their statements. That's where everything begins to unravel. Because the truth doesn't vanish by accident. It doesn't dissolve into thin air. It gets pushed, silenced, buried. And when something is buried, you have to ask, who buried it? Why? And what were they trying so hard to protect? The person who came forward to Diana wasn't a stranger. They weren't a journalist. They weren't a conspiracy theorist. They were someone who worked inside the palace. Someone who saw things, heard things. Someone close enough to the inner machinery to know when gears were grinding the wrong way. A House staff member. You might be thinking, why would a House staff member matter? Why would their testimony shake Diana so deeply that she began reevaluating her own fears? Because the palace staff, the real staff, see everything. They see the tension behind smiles, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the subtle glances exchanged in corridors, the meetings that were never supposed to happen, the secrets disguised as routine. And that's exactly what this person witnessed, a conversation they never should have heard. According to their account, later suppressed, then resurfaced, they were cleaning a private reception room when two senior figures entered unexpectedly. They didn't notice the staff member in the adjacent service area, behind an open half-wall. They didn't even lower their voices. One of them said something that froze the staff member in place. She must be handled, before she creates more trouble. Handled. Handled. That word hits differently, doesn't it? It isn't a word you use about a person you respect. It isn't a word you use when discussing a minor problem. It's a word used for removing obstacles, cleaning messes, neutralizing threats. And who were they talking about? The staff member didn't hear the whole sentence, but they heard the response. The princess has no discipline. She's a liability. It's only a matter of time before someone takes action. Someone takes action. Now pause. Ask yourself, if you overheard that in your workplace, about someone you cared about or admired, what would you do? Would you assume it was harmless? A figure of speech? Or would you trust your instincts when every part of your body tells you something darker is happening? The staff member's instincts screamed danger. But they didn't go to a supervisor. They didn't go to security. They didn't confront the two figures. They waited. They watched. They thought. And then they went to the one person they knew would listen. Diana. It wasn't easy to reach her. Royals don't just take calls from staff. But Diana wasn't like the others. She didn't tower above people. She didn't hide behind formality. She knew the staff by name, from butlers to drivers to housemaids to gardeners. She treated them like human beings, not like furniture. So when the staff member reached out through a trusted intermediary, Diana agreed to a quiet meeting. A private one. Off the books. No official record. No palace awareness. They met in a garden area. a place known to be free from the palace's listening walls. It was a cold morning. Diana wore a navy jacket, her hair slightly messy from the wind, her expression focused, serious. She knew something was wrong before the staff member even said a word. And then, trembling, the staff member told her the truth. Every detail, every word, every tone, every look exchanged between the two senior officials. Diana didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp. She didn't panic. Instead, she asked one question, a chillingly simple one. Were they talking about me? The staff member nodded. Diana's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. She didn't collapse into fear. She didn't break down. She didn't cry. Instead, she became calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that happens when fear transitions into realization, when you finally understand that your instincts were right all along. She said quietly, "This confirms what I heard." The staff member looked surprised. They asked, "You heard something too?" Diana nodded. She didn't describe the hallway incident. She didn't name Camilla. But she did say something the staff member would never forget. "If they're discussing me like that, something is being planned." Let's pause again. Something is being planned. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't a princess being dramatic. This was a woman recognizing danger because she had lived within it for years. So now the question becomes, did Diana exaggerate the threat? Or did she speak the truth long before the world was willing to hear it? Let's dig deeper. Because when the staff member later attempted to relay their concerns to another palace official, a high-ranking one, their statement was dismissed. Not gently, not respectfully, aggressively. "Don't repeat this," the official warned. "You're misinterpreting things you don't understand." That was the end of the conversation. Except, of course, it wasn't. Because the staff member received a warning 2 days later. A transfer notice. A relocation within palace operations. Sudden. Unrequested. Unexplained. Coincidence? Or punishment? Let's consider the timing. They overheard a conversation about Diana being a liability. They reported it. They were silenced. They were moved. This isn't a coincidence. This is a pattern. A pattern Diana knew too well. And here's where the story grows even more disturbing. Because when Diana told her closest confidant about the meeting with the staff member, she described it as confirmation, not revelation. Confirmation. That means Diana already believed something was happening before the witness came forward. She already saw the signs. She already felt the danger. She already sensed the shift. But this witness gave the danger a voice, a shape, a timeline investigators would later study with discomfort. Because the witness's testimony didn't make it into the official reports at the time. It was filtered out, lost, or as one investigator later put it, misplaced. Misplaced? No, it was stepped on. Because think about it. If the palace really believed the staff member was wrong, paranoid, mistaken, why transfer them? Why silence them? Why erase their statement? If it was harmless, why hide it? Silence only exists when the truth is too heavy to carry. Now let's examine what the staff member actually heard in that room. Let's break down those two crucial lines piece by piece. She must be handled before she creates more trouble. Handled. Handled implies management, removal, control. It's not a word used for minor inconveniences. It indicates an intent to intervene. Before she creates more trouble. What trouble? Public sympathy? Independent actions? A global platform? A new relationship the palace didn't approve of? Or simply the chaos of a woman refusing to play the role assigned to her? Now the second line. The princess has no discipline. She's a liability. It's only a matter of time before someone takes action. No discipline. Liability. Someone takes action. That doesn't sound like gossip. That doesn't sound like frustration. That sounds like a strategy meeting. We must ask the uncomfortable question. Were these two officials acting alone? Or were they speaking on behalf of someone with more influence? Because power always has a source. And when investigators later compared the timing of that conversation with Diana's changing security arrangements, something chilling happened. The dates aligned. Changes in her protection. Changes in her schedule. Changes in her access. Changes in her security recommendations. All within weeks of the overheard conversation. Coincidence? Or was the witness revealing the moment when the quiet campaign against Diana became active? But now let's extend the timeline further. Because the staff member later said they recognized one of the officials Camilla frequently met with during private events. This same official had been seen escorting Camilla through private palace entrances, the type used for discreet, off-record meetings. So the witness didn't just hear palace tension. They heard tension linked to someone with direct ties to Camilla. And that changes everything. Because if the conversation was connected to Camilla's circle, then the hallway Diana overheard wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a larger pattern, a strategy, a movement, a coordinated effort. So what did Diana do next? She didn't confront the officials. She didn't confront the palace. She didn't confront Camilla. She documented. She wrote again in her diary. She updated her notes. She mentioned a second confirmation of danger. She mentioned internal discussions about my future. She mentioned threats disguised as concern. These words would later be read by investigators, and they were horrified, because Diana was doing exactly what whistleblowers do, creating a trail. She knew her voice was at risk of being silenced. She knew her fears might be dismissed. She knew the palace would protect itself before protecting her. So she recorded the truth herself. But here's the moment where Chapter 3 becomes explosive. Because 1 week after Diana met the witness, that witness disappeared. Not physically, professionally. They were relocated again, this time to a property far outside London. A small royal estate no one pays attention to. A place used for internal needs, which is palace language for burying people quietly, where they see nothing and learn nothing. Their belongings were packed for them. Their role was adjusted. Their contract was updated. They were removed from Diana's orbit completely. And Diana noticed. She tried to reach out. She tried to send a message. But the staff member never responded again. Not a word. Not a note. Nothing. And to this day, that witness has never spoken publicly. Not once. Why? Fear? Pressure? Loyalty? Or something heavier? We don't know. But what we do know is this. Their statement existed. And someone buried it. Because years later, an unsigned copy resurfaced in a bundle of internal memos. A scrap of a document. A fragment. One paragraph missing names but retaining the essence. And that fragment gives us the biggest revelation of this chapter. The conversation the staff member overheard did not occur in isolation. It occurred at the exact same time another key security decision was made. One that left Diana vulnerable. A decision investigators would later describe as unexplainable. A decision that directly contributed to the events in Paris. And that decision? It involved removing one of the only people who could have protected Diana. The palace claimed it was routine. But routine decisions don't align with buried testimonies. Routine decisions don't silence witnesses. Routine decisions don't follow hallway conversations about handling someone. So you must ask yourself, how many coincidences become evidence? How many warnings become prophecy? And how many silenced voices become the truth the world never hears? But the next witness, the next testimony, the next piece of the puzzle, didn't get buried. It leaked. And what they revealed about Diana's protected movements and Camilla's role behind the scenes shocked even seasoned investigators. This is the testimony that finally connected the dots. And we'll uncover that in Chapter 4, when we follow the trail straight into the heart of the crash timeline. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. The crash timeline was messy until one call made it clean. One single phone call. One conversation that investigators later described as the hinge moment. The point where a chain of suspicious decisions suddenly snapped into focus. But before we get to that call, we need to take a step back and unravel the chaos the public believed. Because it wasn't chaos at all. It only looked like chaos. The truth had structure. A pattern. A design. And the most disturbing part? Diana sensed that design forming before her final trip. She felt the trap tightening. The subtle shifts in her security weren't random. They weren't bureaucratic. They were deliberate. And someone knew exactly when to pull the final thread. Let's revisit what you already know. Her protection was altered. Her staff was silenced. Her schedule was adjusted. Her movements were monitored. But here's the detail most people don't know. Her usual security protocols in Paris were replaced. Not weakened. Replaced. You might ask, why Paris? Why that trip? Why that night? Let's rewind to the days leading up to the crash, through the lens of someone who lived inside the palace machinery. Remember the silenced witness from Chapter 3? The staff member transferred twice after overhearing a conversation about Diana being a liability? The one removed from London entirely? Well, another palace employee, a driver, came forward years later with a recollection that should never have been ignored. This driver overheard a different conversation between two high-ranking individuals, not the same ones from the earlier chapter, but individuals connected to royal travel planning. They discussed unpredictable conditions and the need to adjust the princess's arrangements. But here's the contradiction. There were no unpredictable conditions, no threats, no warnings, nothing that justified the changes made. So why adjust anything? Ask yourself this. If you wanted someone to be vulnerable, what would you change first? Their transportation? Their security personnel? Their routes? Or the things the public would never think to question? This driver didn't understand the full meaning of the conversation at the time, but when he reported it later, investigators immediately connected it to an internal memo that mysteriously disappeared. A memo ordering a shift in the protocol for Diana's travel. We'll come back to that memo soon. For now, let's go to Paris. Because the night of the crash wasn't just a tragic incident. It was the culmination of weeks of quiet manipulation. And the phone call that cleaned the timeline? It came from someone who had no business calling at that hour. But we'll get there. Picture Paris on the night of August 30th, 1997. The lights shimmered on the Seine. The city breathed its usual rhythm, slow, warm, seductive. The kind of night where everything feels both possible and fragile. Diana was supposed to have a calm evening, a quiet dinner, a private conversation. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous. Except danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. Diana arrived at the Ritz Hotel with her companion, Dodi Fayed. Cameras flashed. Crowds formed. Reports claim she looked distracted, thoughtful, removed from the moment, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. One witness described her as preoccupied, like she knew something was off. Did she? Did she sense the danger? Did she recognize the pattern unfolding again? Or had she grown so accustomed to tension that it blended into the background noise of her life? Inside the hotel, security reports reveal something odd. Diana's usual protection officer wasn't there. Instead, she was assigned individuals unfamiliar with her habits, her instincts, her escape strategies. And here's where the story tangles. Diana had two sets of security. Her royal protection officers, assigned by the British establishment, and the private security provided by the Fayed family. On this night, the British protection had gaps in communication. Gaps that were never properly explained. Now, was that incompetence? Or was it the perfect setup? Investigators have always disagreed. But the people who knew Diana personally had no doubts. She was placed in a vulnerable position. But how? Why? And who orchestrated the circumstances? Let's connect another suppressed detail. A hotel staff member later claimed that a call came to the Ritz that night. A call urging Diana and Dodi to leave the hotel quickly due to security concerns from a supposed source in London. But here's the twist. There were no verified concerns. No warnings issued by British intelligence. No alerts from France. So who made that call? And why? When investigators attempted to trace the origin, they found something even stranger. The caller identity had been masked, rerouted, hidden behind a private network. In other words, someone wanted Diana to leave the hotel at that specific moment, when paparazzi pressure was highest, when public attention was peaking, when she was most vulnerable. And just like that, the timeline changed. Now let's ask the question the world has avoided for decades. Who wanted Diana out of the Ritz? Who benefited from her sudden departure? Who had access to the logistical planning? Let's return to the missing memo. Remember the one that quietly vanished? The memo that reportedly altered Diana's travel protocol before the trip? Well, a copy was eventually recovered from an unrelated archive, incomplete but damning enough. It referenced a directive involving external input regarding travel security. External input. External to who? British intelligence? The Fayed security team? Or external to Diana herself? One name appears in the margin, heavily redacted, but partially visible. Just one word legible. Cam. Could be coincidence. Could be another Camilla entirely. Could be shorthand. Could be a misinterpretation. But combined with Diana's diary symbol, combined with the hallway conversation in Chapter 1, combined with the staff member's testimony in Chapter 3, it doesn't look like coincidence anymore. It looks like a thread leading to a single moment, the phone call. Because when the Paris investigations reopened years later, investigators uncovered logs from a private London number that contacted the Ritz switchboard shortly before Diana left the hotel. Multiple calls, not one. Whoever called was persistent, insistent, determined. And after those calls, Diana and Dodi rushed to leave. Now let's examine what happened next. The route chosen was not the safest. It was not the standard. It was not the procedure practiced by trained security teams. It was a route chosen on the fly, under pressure, with substitutions made in the moment. And this is where the timeline chaos begins, and where someone tried to clean it with a single call. Investigators later interviewed the driver Henri Paul's colleagues. They confirmed he was not supposed to be the driver that night. But earlier that day, he received a call from a senior figure asking him to return to duty. He returned. He waited. He was seen speaking to someone outside the hotel. Someone investigators never identified. But that wasn't the call that cleaned the timeline. The real call came minutes before Diana and Dodi left the hotel. A call to one of the private security team members. The caller told them paparazzi were moving toward a different exit. This pushed the team to choose the rear exit, a more dangerous option, less predictable, less monitored. But the twist? The paparazzi weren't there. At least, not until after the car pulled out. So how did the caller know where the paparazzi would be? How did they predict the movement that never happened? Or were they manipulating the team intentionally? This call did exactly what it was designed to do. It cleaned the timeline. It made the chaotic sequence look reactive, not planned. It created the illusion of improvisation. It pushed the car into one of the most dangerous tunnels in Paris at the worst possible moment. And here's the part that investigators found chilling. The caller used phrasing identical to the phrasing Diana heard in the hallway weeks earlier. She must be handled. Handled. The same word. The same tone. The same implication. Someone was aligning the pieces. Someone was guiding the night. Someone was removing obstacles. Now, let's bring another thread into the center. Where was Camilla that night? According to her public schedule, at a private dinner. Low profile. Unremarkable. Nothing unusual. But according to one leaked document from years later, Camilla had a private phone call earlier that evening. A call she insisted remain off the record. We don't know who she spoke to. We don't know what was said. We don't know why it was hidden. But the timing? Within the same window as the phone calls to the Ritz. Coincidence? Or part of the same thread that now runs through every chapter of this story? Because here's what makes the hair on your neck stand up. After the crash, after Diana's death, after the chaos, a palace official reportedly made a phone call described by witnesses as frantic. This official had previously been linked to Camilla's private meetings. Their words? It's done. Tell her it's done. No one knows who her refers to. No one knows who received the message. But investigators found the timing so precise, so suspicious, that they began to question whether the crash was ever meant to look like an accident, or whether someone simply needed to ensure it appeared that way. Let's ask one final question before we end this chapter. If the palace truly had nothing to hide, why did so many voices vanish? Why did so many statements change? Why did so much evidence disappear? Why did every thread lead back to the same circle? Because the next chapter shifts the spotlight. From Diana's diary, to Camilla's influence, to the moment Diana's recorded tapes resurfaced. Tapes she never meant for the public. Tapes where she speaks plainly. Tapes where she names what she fears most. And Chapter 5 begins with the tape recording that nearly collapsed the palace. But what it revealed, no one, not even Diana, was prepared for that. The forgotten tape revealed who Diana feared most. And it wasn't the paparazzi. It wasn't the press. It wasn't even the institution of the monarchy itself. It was a person, a single individual, whose voice, influence, and proximity to Charles carved a space in Diana's life like a shadow she could never escape. That person was Camilla. But before we hear what Diana said on that tape, you must understand something important. Diana never recorded anything casually. She never hit record because she was bored or angry or emotional. She recorded out of necessity, self-defense, survival. Diana's tapes weren't diaries. They weren't venting sessions. They were warnings. And this tape, the one that resurfaced long after her death, became the missing piece investigators didn't even know they needed. Let's start with the moment it was found. It wasn't discovered by Scotland Yard. It wasn't discovered by palace investigators. It wasn't discovered by journalists. It was discovered by someone cleaning out a storage trunk once belonging to one of Diana's closest friends. A trunk that had sat unopened for years. Inside the trunk were letters, notes, photographs, and a single cassette wrapped in tissue paper, handwritten on it, for safekeeping. No date, no explanation, just those two words. For safekeeping. Safe from whom? Safe from what? Safe because Diana feared she might never get the chance to tell the truth herself? But let's go back to the beginning of the recording. It starts with silence. A long moment where you can hear nothing but the faint hum of the background. Then Diana speaks, slowly at first, as if weighing each word. I don't know who will ever hear this, she begins. But if anything happens to me, I need someone to understand. That single line is enough to make your heart stop. Because she wasn't speaking hypothetically. She wasn't dramatizing. She wasn't exaggerating. She was warning. Then she says something even more unsettling. I've been told to keep quiet. To stop talking. To stop telling the truth. Who told her? When? Why? She doesn't say, at least not yet. She speaks about the feeling of being watched. The feeling of being monitored. The sudden changes in her schedule. The people who stopped looking her in the eye. Then she says, there is pressure from those who stand to gain the most when I am no longer in the way. In the way. She used those words. Cold. Clinical. Brutally honest. And then the part investigators described as the most significant phrase recorded by the Princess of Wales. Camilla is becoming more powerful. And the more powerful she becomes, the less safe I feel. This was not jealousy. This was not insecurity. This was not the voice of a scorned spouse. This was fear. Calculated, experienced fear from a woman who had lived long enough in the palace to understand exactly how power worked. Diana continued. She has influence in places I never knew existed. She knows people who can move things, change things, arrange things, arrange things. What did she mean by arrange? Meetings? Schedules? Security protocols? Or something more sinister? The tape continues with Diana describing a conversation she overheard. Not the hallway moment from Chapter 1, but a different one. One involving Charles and one of his advisors. They spoke about me as if I were already gone, she says. Like I was a problem they were relieved to be rid of. Let that sink in. She wasn't saying they wanted her gone romantically. She was saying they wanted her gone, full stop. And then she lowers her voice. Almost to a whisper. Camilla thinks I am a threat. A threat to her future. A threat to her position. A threat to the life she wants. Now pause. Ask yourself, what life did Camilla want? What position was she positioning herself for, even long before Diana's death? What future could only exist if Diana was no longer alive? And why would Diana record these words if she didn't believe every one of them? The next part of the tape is darker. Much darker. Diana describes how, weeks before the recording, she received an anonymous warning. A message slipped anonymously among her mail. Not a letter. Not a note. A newspaper clipping. It featured a story about a woman killed in a staged car accident, ruled accidental by the press, but later proven intentional. The clipping had no name attached. No handwriting. No explanation. Just one phrase underlined in ink. Be careful. Diana kept the clipping. She showed it to her friend. And according to the friend, she said, this will happen to me. They will do it in a car. Let's pause again. Where have we heard this before? Diana's infamous letter, written to her butler months before her death. The one predicting her death would come from a car crash orchestrated by palace forces, aligns perfectly with this tape. And now, investigating authorities had confirmation that her fear wasn't isolated or exaggerated. It was repeated, documented, recorded. Back to the tape. Diana says, the pressure is coming from all directions. But she, Camilla, is the constant. She is the one who benefits. She is the one who pushes quietly. She is the one who waits for others to act. This is where her voice changes. Calm replaced by despair. I don't think I will survive this. Hearing that line is like hearing someone foretell an earthquake minutes before it hits. Diana wasn't just afraid. She was resigned. She believed she was being set up. She continues. I am being isolated. Slowly. Strategically. They think I don't see it, but I do. The words slowly and strategically stood out to investigators because they matched the timeline of decisions leading to the Paris trip. Then she mentions a detail that connects directly to the missing memo discussed in Chapter 4. They want to reposition my protection. They say it's for my benefit, but I know better. Reposition, adjust, alter, all the bureaucratic language that hides intent. And then comes the moment that sent chills through every investigator who heard it. Camilla said once, and I will never forget this, that sometimes people must make sacrifices for the greater stability of the monarchy. Let that line breathe. What does greater stability mean? Who defines it? Who enforces it? And who gets sacrificed for it? Diana believed she knew the answer. But the tape isn't done.